The village slept. It lay quiet under the night, a group of dark shapes resting together. The moon had already crossed most of the sky and was now moving slowly down toward the western hills. Its light was softer than before, thinner and calmer. This was the deepest part of the night, when even dreams seemed to slow down. At this hour, only one person was still awake. Old Tomas, the night watchman, began his final round. His work was simple and quiet. He did it every night, not because he feared danger, but because the village needed care. This walk was a habit, as old as the stone houses and the narrow paths. Tomas carried a small lantern. The flame was low to save oil, and the light it gave was weak but steady. It made a small circle on the ground in front of his feet. The light moved with him, always close, as he walked. He moved slowly and carefully. He knew every stone in the road, every small dip and turn. His steps followed the same path each night, a gentle loop around the edge of the village. Here, the last houses met the open fields. His boots made a soft crunch on the gravel. It was the only sound. Tomas was not searching for trouble. Trouble rarely came here. Instead, he listened to the night. He listened to be sure everything was calm. His eyes, used to the dark, moved over barns, fences, and closed doors. Everything was familiar. Everything was as it should be. He stopped at the eastern gate. It was a simple wooden arch that marked the old road into the village. Tomas raised his lantern a little. The light touched the warm wood and the iron latch. The gate was closed and strong. All was well. He stood there for a moment, looking beyond the gate into the darkness outside. The world beyond was unknown, full of shadows and distant sounds. But inside the gate was his world. It was known, ordered, and safe. This difference mattered to him. He was proud to help keep it that way. Turning back, Tomas walked along the line of cottages at the southern edge. The thatched roofs were wet with dew and shone faintly in the moonlight. No windows were lit. Every home slept. He imagined the villagers breathing slowly inside their houses, warm and safe. When he reached the cobbler's workshop, he stopped again. A wooden shutter moved slightly in the wind. It tapped softly against the wall. Tap. Tap. The sound was small, but it broke the silence. Tomas stepped closer. He placed his lantern on the ground and lifted his hands. They knew what to do without thought. He closed the shutter and secured the latch. The tapping stopped. The silence returned, deeper and fuller than before. Tomas nodded once. It was a small task, but it mattered. He continued past the silent porch. Its chimney rose dark against the sky. He passed the bakery, where the air still held a faint smell of bread. He checked the door of the storehouse. The lock was firm. He crossed the empty square and passed the well. His lantern light touched the dark water far below, showing only a brief orange reflection before it disappeared. His round was nearly complete. Near the western edge of the village, the sky began to change. It was not yet light, but the darkness was weaker. The deep blue in the east softened. Stars there lost some of their sharpness. Tomas reached the small watchman's hut. Inside, there was a stool and a small table. He entered and set the lantern down. Sitting, he felt the welcome ache of rest in his bones. He poured a little water from a clay jug and drank slowly. The hut was quiet. He listened. Through the open doorway, he watched the village. It still slept, dark and still, but the night was slowly letting go. The sky at the edge of the world was no longer black. It was turning a deep, gentle blue. The moon hung low, tired, casting long and fading shadows. Tomas felt calm pride. His watch had held. Nothing was broken. Nothing was disturbed. The sounds of the night, the call of an owl, the movement of a small animal in the hedge, felt right and normal. They belonged here. He did not sleep. His duty was to stay awake until the change was complete. He was the link between night and morning. The lantern's flame grew weaker as the oil ran low. Tomas watched the eastern sky. The darkness was slowly moving away. Dawn had not come yet, but its promise was clear. The watch was almost over. The village slept on, unaware of his care. But it was safe. The night had passed in steady hands. Soon, the morning would arrive and take his place. The last piece of iron glowed orange on the anvil, holding the final color of the sunset. The sky outside had already lost its light, but here, inside the forge, the fire was still awake. Elias, the blacksmith, stood before it, his body shaped by years of heat and work. His arms rose and fell in a steady rhythm, slow and sure. This rhythm was older than the village itself. The hammer came down with a clear sound. Clang. Sparks jumped into the air and disappeared at once. Clang. The sound echoed from the stone walls, sharp and clean. It was not an angry sound. It was a finishing sound. The sound that said the work was almost done. The forge answered with its own noise, a low breath of heat and fire behind him. Elias worked carefully. This was not rough work. He was not shaping new iron. He was finishing a simple hook for a barn door. It was a small thing, but he treated it with respect. Each strike had a reason. Each movement had a purpose. The hot iron bent and changed under his control, slowly becoming what it needed to be. The heat from the iron lit his face with a deep red glow. Sweat darkened his apron. The air around the anvil shimmered with warmth. Behind him, the fire breathed, pushing waves of dry heat into the room. The forge felt alive, but calm, as if it knew the day was ending. At last, Elias gave a final light tap. Then he stopped. He set the hammer down. The hook lay on the anvil, no longer bright orange, but fading quickly to red, then dark gray. The ringing sound was gone. In its place came softer noises. A cow lowed somewhere far away. A breeze moved through the open door. The fire crackled quietly. Elias lifted the hook with long tongs and lowered it into a barrel of water. There was a sharp hiss. Steam rose fast, white and thick, then slowly disappeared into the air. The smell of hot iron and old water filled the space. The iron was finished. He placed the hook on a rack with other pieces made that day. Nails, a repaired hinge, a handle for a plow. Simple objects, ready for use. Then his movements changed. They became slower, more careful. The work of the day was ending. The work of closing began. He took a long iron tool and moved the burning coals in the forge. He spread them apart so the fire would lose its strength. The bright light faded. Yellow and white became deep red. The shadows in the corners of the workshop grew longer. Darkness began to return. Elias cleaned his tools. The hammer went back on its peg. The tongs rested on the anvil. Smaller tools were wiped and placed in their places. Each tool had a home. This order was important. It told the forge that the day was done. The fire continued to fade. The glowing coals broke into small embers, each one breathing softly with heat. Their light was weaker now, but steady. The rest of the workshop sank into shadow. The anvil became a dark shape. The walls seemed farther away. Elias stood still and watched the embers. His breathing slowed. The heat that had pressed against him all day began to leave his skin. The quiet grew deeper. The forge, once loud and bright, was now calm and resting. The work of fire and iron was nearly complete. The embers required one final act of care. Elias took a metal lid, its surface blackened and blistered from years of use, and placed it gently over the heart of the forge. It settled with a soft, gritty scrape, a definitive seal. A few thin tendrils of gray smoke escaped from the edges for a moment, then ceased. The deep, pulsing glow that had painted the underside of the lid with a faint orange halo began to fade, starved of air. The last visible light in the workshop was now being gently smothered, a living thing being coaxed into a dormant sleep until the bellows would breathe life back into it with the dawn. He turned to the stone basin set against the wall, where a pitcher of clean water waited. Pouring the cool water over his hands, he scrubbed at the grime embedded in the lines of his skin, the soot under his nails, the fine, metallic dust that coated his arms up to the elbows. The water in the basin turned a cloudy gray, swirling with the residue of the day's work. He cupped his hands, brought water to his face, and washed the sweat and soot from his brow, his cheeks, the back of his neck. The sensation was a profound relief, a clear, cool line drawn between the heat of labor and the calm of evening. He dried himself on a rough piece of sacking, the coarse fabric of familiar comfort. Then he stood still, in the near darkness, and looked at his quiet workshop. His eyes, adjusted to the gloom, traced the familiar shapes. The anvil was a solid, squat shadow in the center of the room, a dormant altar. The tools on their pegs and racks were barely visible, mere suggestions of form. The walls, stained dark by decades of smoke, seemed to absorb what little light remained, holding the day's heat within their stones. The air, once vibrating with heat and noise, now felt thick and still, heavy with the smells of cooled iron, old ash, damp stone, and leather. It was a good smell, the smell of purpose fulfilled. This space, which by day was a realm of fire and force, of ringing clamor and urgent creation, had been transformed. It was now a cave of silence, a vault where the echoes of the hammered blows lingered only as memory in the timber beams. His gaze lingered on the rack where the day's work lay, the dark, cool shapes of the hook, the nails, the mended hinge. They were inert now, simple objects. But in the morning, they would be taken away, each to play its small part in the life of the village, to hold a door, to join two pieces of wood, to bear weight. This was the quiet truth of his craft. He made the unseen things, the unremarkable things, upon which the visible world depended. The satisfaction was a deep, silent pool within him. On the workbench sat a single, small oil lamp, its wick trimmed. This was the last light. He struck a flint, the brief, sharp spark startling in the stillness, and touched the flame to the wick. A small, yellow bloom of light pushed back the shadows immediately around the bench, making the darkness beyond seem even deeper and more velvety. He used this light for one final glance, a ritual check. All was in order. All was at rest. Then he leaned forward and, with a soft puff of breath, blew out the lamp. The darkness was instantaneous and total. It was not a frightening dark, but a rich, complete one, like closing one's eyes. For a moment, he saw the ghost of the flame imprinted on his vision, a bright negative shape that quickly faded. His other senses sharpened. He heard the ancient timber of the roof creak softly as it cooled. He smelled the oil from the extinguished wick. He felt the solid, packed earth floor beneath his boots. He stood in the perfect blackness, a part of it now, his day's work fully concluded and enclosed within the night. Turning, he moved with unerring steps toward the heavy wooden door, his hand finding the iron latch by feel. He lifted it, pulled the door inward, and stepped across the threshold. The evening light outside was a revelation. It was not the bold gold of day, but a soft, pervasive twilight, a blue-gray wash that filled the sky and bathed the world in a gentle, forgiving luminescence. After the absolute dark of the smithy, it seemed almost bright. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of damp grass and wood smoke from cottage chimneys. He took a deep, slow breath, filling his lungs with it. He turned back, grasped the door's edge, and pulled it shut. The iron latch fell into place with a solid, final clunk. The sound sealed the smithy away, a capsule of darkness and spent heat. Now he was outside, and the workshop was inside, a separate, sleeping entity. Elias stood for a moment on the packed earth before his door, feeling the cool air on his freshly washed skin. He looked toward the village, where the first few candlelights were beginning to appear in windows, tiny, steady stars against the deepening blue. His own home lay in that direction, a place of warmth and quiet conversation awaiting him. With one last, backward glance at the dark, silent shape of his smithy, he turned his steps toward the lane. His boots made a soft, steady sound on the path, a new rhythm replacing the day's hammer strikes, carrying him away from the realm of fire and iron and into the gentle embrace of the evening. The transition was complete. The blacksmith had finished. The heat in the bakery was a living presence, a dense, yeasty warmth that clung to the skin and filled the lungs with the promise of sustenance. At its heart stood Anya, her forearms dusted with a fine, pale powder like the first frost of the season, her face flushed from the oven's breath. Before her, the great brick oven's iron door stood open, a portal to a realm of transformative fire. Inside, on the long wooden peel, rested the final batch of loaves. They were perfect. Their crusts were a deep, uniform gold, the color of a harvest moon, and they had split along their tops in graceful, flour-dusted cracks that spoke of a vigorous, healthy rise. The smell that rolled out was profound, a rich, nutty aroma of perfectly caramelized grain, underpinned by the sweet, earthy fragrance of the ferment that had given them life. With a practiced, careful motion, she slid the peel backward, drawing the loaves from their fiery cradle into the cooler air of the shop. They steamed gently, their heat radiating invisible waves that made the air above them shimmer. She transferred them, one by one, to the wide, scrubbed pine counter near the window, their bottoms making soft, solid thumps. They joined a dozen others from earlier batches, a small army of golden brown soldiers lined up in neat rows, their warmth a collective glow. This was the day's culmination, the physical manifestation of hours begun in the pre-dawn dark, of kneading, shaping, and patient waiting. She ran a hand lightly over the crust of one loaf, feeling its satisfying hardness give way to the anticipated softness beneath. A good bake. A day's work well done. The counter now full, she turned her attention to the closing rituals. She took a damp cloth and began to wipe down the vast central table, its surface scarred and stained from years of use. The cloth swept away stray flour, bits of dough, the ghostly impressions of countless loaves shaped there. Each pass revealed more of the wood's pale grain, cleaning the slate of the day's creativity. The simple, repetitive motion was meditative. The quiet of the shop, now that the oven's roar was subsiding, was a palpable thing, broken only by the soft scrape of the cloth and the occasional crackle from the cooling oven. Next, she took the broom from its corner. Its bristles whispered against the stone-flagged floor, gathering the flour that had drifted like fine snow, collecting the occasional raisin or oat that had escaped a mixing bowl. She swept the detritus into a small, pale mound near the door, the ephemeral remains of creation. This, too, was part of the rhythm. The making of bread was a generous, messy art, and the cleaning was its necessary echo, a restoration of order. As she worked, the last of the daylight, now a soft lavender gray, slanted through the front window, illuminating the dancing motes of flour she had stirred into the air, turning them into a slow, golden swirl. Behind her, the oven's heat was fading. The fierce, dry blast that had greeted the open door had softened to a gentle, ambient warmth. The bricks of the oven's exterior, which had glowed with retained heat, now held only a deep, somber warmth. The fire within had been banked hours ago. Now, only a deep bed of ash retained a memory of the flames, a dormant power that would keep the oven warm until morning, ready to be rekindled. The change in the bakery's atmosphere was subtle but profound. The air lost its aggressive dryness, becoming merely warm and fragrant. The space felt less like a crucible and more like a room again, a place that was soon to be vacated. With the floor swept, Anya returned the broom and stood for a moment in the center of her domain. Her eyes moved over the familiar sights, the sacks of flour stacked like plump, silent sentinels against the wall, the ceramic bowls upturned on shelves, the worn recipe book with its spattered pages. Everything was in its place. The quiet was now complete, a rich, textured silence filled with the lingering perfume of bread and the faint, metallic scent of cooling iron from the oven door. It was a satisfying quiet, the quiet of fullness, of a task entirely and perfectly concluded. She walked to the front window and looked out. The village lane was empty, bathed in the deep blue of twilight. A single lamp was being lit in a window across the way, its flame a tiny, steady eye. Her own reflection, faint and ghostly, looked back at her from the glass, superimposed over the gathering night. She was a figure in a portrait of tranquility, surrounded by the golden loaves that glowed softly in the dim light from the window. They were more than food, they were tomorrow's breakfast, a child's midday meal, a shared supper. They were comfort and community, baked solid. Turning, she took a final, long breath of the bakery's air, committing its warmth and scent to memory. She then moved to the rear door, where her shawl hung on a peg. She wrapped it around her shoulders, the wool a soft, familiar weight. One last duty remained. She went to the counter and selected 2 of the smaller, plainer loaves, the ones that had baked a little darker, the crusts a touch thicker. These were not for sale. She wrapped them in a clean cloth and tucked the bundle under her arm. They were for old Tomas, the night watchman, who had little time for baking, and for the widow Clemens, whose hands were too frail to knead. A silent tradition, as much a part of her day as the baking itself. At the front door, she lifted the iron bar and set it in its brackets, locking the world out and the day's work in. She stepped into the cool evening, pulling the door shut behind her. The solid thud of the wood was the final note. Through the window, the rows of loaves were now just dark, rounded shapes on the counter, their golden crusts muted to umber in the vanishing light. The bakery was quiet. The oven's heat faded, a farewell warmth seeping slowly into the stones. The room, so recently alive with heat and industry, settled into a deep, contented slumber, holding within its walls the essence of bread and the echo of a baker's care, waiting silently for the sun and the new day's flour. The last light was a memory, a faint stain of orange and purple smudged along the western hills where the sun had vanished. In the fields, the world had turned to shades of gray and deep blue. The harvested wheat stood in neat, stubbled rows, the cut stalks pale and sharp against the dark soil. The air, which had hummed with the heat of the day and the song of insects, now carried only a cool, damp stillness, smelling of earth, crushed straw, and the coming dew. The farmers moved slowly within this quiet, their day's labor a weight in their bones and a satisfaction in their hearts. They gathered at the field's edge where the tall oak tree stood, its broad canopy now a black lace work against the slightly lighter sky. Here, they performed the final, careful rituals of the day. Scythes, their curved blades still by use but still gleaming with a cold, dangerous light, were wiped clean with handfuls of dry grass. Each man examined his blade with a critical eye, running a thumb along the back to check for nicks, before sliding it into a leather sheath. The sheaths were then hung from belts or slung over shoulders, the tools transformed from instruments of harvest into quiet companions for the walk home. The baskets, woven from willow and now empty of their golden burdens, were stacked together. They looked like the discarded shells of some large, gentle creature, light and hollow were hours before they had been heavy with grain. There was little talk, and what words were spoken were soft, murmured things, more like the natural sounds of the evening than true conversation. A low grunt of satisfaction as a back was straightened. A sigh that was half weariness, half contentment. A few brief, exchanged glances that carried whole conversations about the yield, about the clean cut of the stalks, about the luck of the weather. They stood for a moment in a loose circle, not looking at each other, but looking back at the field they had left. It was a different place now. By day, it had been a sea of gold, alive with movement and purpose. Now, it was a dark, sleeping plain, a vast and orderly quiet. The sheaves, gathered into stooks earlier in the afternoon, stood like silent, conical sentinels in the gloom, guarding the fruit of the labor. There was a profound peace in this sight, a visual full stop at the end of a long sentence of work. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, they turned toward the path. It was a dirt track, worn smooth by generations of feet and cartwheels, a pale ribbon winding away from the fields and into the deeper shadow of the hedgerows. They fell into step, not in a formal line, but in a loose, comfortable cluster. Their footsteps were slow and heavy, the tread of men whose strength was spent but whose spirits were easy. The sound was a soft, rhythmic crunch on the gravelly soil, a quiet drumbeat marking their progress homeward. The leather of their boots creaked. A carried scythe handle would occasionally tap against another with a dull talk. The world around them deepened into night. The hedgerows on either side of the path became walls of impenetrable shadow, buzzing faintly with the last crickets of the season. Above, the first brave stars pricked through the velvet canopy, cold and distant. The farmers barely looked up. Their world was the path at their feet and the darkness ahead. But they felt the vastness of the sky, the cooling air, the gentle closing in of the night. It was a familiar embrace, the end of every autumn day. Then, one of them, the eldest, with a beard like frosted wire, paused and pointed with his chin. Ahead, beyond a gentle rise and a copse of dark trees, a cluster of tiny lights had appeared. They were the village windows. From this distance, they were mere pinpricks, golden and steady, some on the ground level, some higher up in the gables of the thatched roofs. They seemed impossibly small and fragile against the immense dark of the landscape, like a handful of fallen stars caught in the hollow of the hills. Yet each one held a world of meaning. That one was the baker's kitchen. That one, slightly brighter, was the hearth in the tavern. Those two close together were the front room of the miller's house. The sight worked a subtle change in the men. Their shoulders, which had been slumped with fatigue, straightened just a little. Their steps, while still slow, gained a new purpose. The lights were a promise, a visual anchor. They spoke of warmth, of a chair by the fire, of a bowl of stew and a mug of cider. They spoke of voices that were not their own, of women and children, of the soft, domestic sounds that were the counterpoint to the day's outdoor toil. Home was waiting. It was not just a building, but a condition, a state of rest, of safety, of being known. The path they walked was no longer just a track through the fields. It was a bridge between two states of being, from the solitary, physical realm of work to the shared, gentle realm of hearth and family. They walked on, the lights growing slowly, imperceptibly larger. The path began a gentle descent, and the village, nestled in its valley, started to reveal itself as more than just lights. The dark, bulky shapes of roofs and the taller spire of the well house became visible against the sky. The murmur of a distant stream, unseen in the dark, found their ears, a liquid whisper accompanying their footsteps. The air grew slightly warmer, carrying now the distinct, sweet scent of wood smoke from 100 chimneys, a smell that was the very breath of the village itself. They were almost there. The long, good day in the fields was behind them. The quiet walk was its epilogue, a slow unwinding of the body and mind, a transition made step by heavy, deliberate step, drawn forward by the small, golden promises shining in the distance. The night was complete around them, but they were not lost in it. They were following a trail of light. The path descended gently, and the soft gurgle of the stream grew from a suggestion to a clear, companionable sound. The water was invisible in the dark, a hidden voice threading through the roots of alder and willow, but its presence was a cool breath against their faces. Then the old bridge emerged from the gloom, its stone arch a darker curve over the whispering blackness. Their boots found the familiar, worn planks laid across its back, the hollow thumps echoing briefly before being swallowed by the stream's chatter. For a moment, each man was suspended between the fields and the village, between the wild and the tame, with the ancient water flowing beneath him. The bridge was a threshold, and crossing it felt like passing through an unseen gate, leaving the vast, open responsibility of the land for the contained, human-scale world ahead. Once across, they paused as one, a habit born of countless evenings. They turned their faces upward. The sky, now fully claimed by night, was no longer an empty void. The first stars were there, not yet in their multitudes, but a scattering of the brightest pioneers. A steady, cold point of light marked the north. A blue-white gem flickered low in the west. These were old friends, their positions as familiar as the landmarks of the village. The men looked at them in silence, their breaths forming faint plumes in the cooling air. The stars offered no warmth, but they offered constancy, a map that never changed, a reminder of an order larger than seasons or harvests. In their silent light, the weariness of the body felt smaller, absorbed into something timeless. They moved on, the path now softer underfoot, edged with moss and last year's leaves. And then, softly, words began to surface in the dark. They were not about the work, not about the weight of the baskets or the sharpness of the blades. They were about the day itself, spoken in low, gravelly tones that blended with the night sounds. a mention of the clean, dry straw, a remark about the way the last sheaf had stood straight and full, a simple, heartfelt observation that it had been a good day. There were no elaborate speeches, no celebrations. The statements were plain and solid, like the stones in the bridge, each one a quiet brick in the wall of their shared satisfaction. The words were less for communication than for affirmation, a way of sealing the day's success in the air between them, of turning individual effort into a collective memory. Their tiredness was a deep, physical fact, a pleasant heaviness in every limb. It was the honest fatigue that comes not from struggle, but from full, complete effort. It weighed their steps but did not drag their spirits. Instead, it produced a calm, pervasive happiness, a glow that came from within and had nothing to do with the cold starlight. It was the happiness of emptiness, of empty baskets, of empty fields, of muscles emptied of their strength. It was a happiness that asked for nothing more than the path home and the rest that waited there. Their faces, shadowed in the dark, were relaxed, the lines etched by sun and wind softened by the twilight and the gentle camaraderie of the walk. Then the village unveiled itself fully. The cluster of golden pinpricks resolved into individual windows, each a square of warm, buttery light. They were scattered among the dark, thatched mounds of the cottages, some at ground level, some peeking from under eaves. Candlelight and firelight, not the harsh, uniform glare of modern bulbs, but a light that lived and breathed. It flickered gently behind panes of glass or oiled parchment, making the windows seem not like holes in the darkness, but like living, luminous eyes. From this distance, they could see the faintest suggestion of movement within, a shadow passing, a shape bending, intimate glimpses of other lives settling into the evening's peace. The sight was a balm. It spoke of hearths stoked, of tables being set, of the day's minor stories being shared in quiet tones. It was the visual proof of the community they had labored to sustain. The path, faithful and true, curved one last time around the mill pond, where the dark water reflected a few shaky stars, and then became the village lane. The hard-packed earth was now under their feet, flanked by the first garden fences and the scent of damp rosemary from a cottage hedge. The sounds changed too. The absolute quiet of the fields was replaced by the subtle, domestic symphony of homecoming. A door closed softly somewhere ahead. A child's laugh, muffled by walls, bubbled out and faded. The chink of a pot came from an open doorway. They passed the blacksmith's dark workshop, the bakery with its lingering, sweet aroma, the well house with its still rope. They were back within the architecture of their daily lives. The group began to fragment, effortlessly and without farewell. One man turned down the narrow alley beside the cobbler's shop. Another pushed open a wooden gate with a familiar creak. A third simply raised a hand in a silent gesture as he approached his own lit doorway. The cluster dissolved, each man drawn by the specific pull of his own window's light. Their shared journey, which had begun in the collective labor of the field and continued through the shared silence of the walk, now completed itself in these individual returns. The path had done its job. It had led them from the wide, open work of the earth to the small, closed circle of the family. Each step had been a movement from abundance to intimacy, from fatigue to rest, from the silent understanding between comrades to the spoken comforts of home. They vanished into their houses, the doors closing softly behind them, leaving the lane empty and quiet once more, just a track between sleeping cottages, its purpose fulfilled until the dawn would call them out again. The village, having drawn its people inward, now began to illuminate itself from within, one tiny, deliberate flame at a time. Outside, the world was a study in monochrome, a landscape of deep blues and black velvet shadows where shapes blurred into one another. But inside the cottages, a different kind of creation was underway, not of objects, but of atmosphere. It began in the deepening gloom of a room as the last of the twilight faded from the window panes. A hand would reach into the darkness, familiar and unerring, finding the small, waiting form of a candlestick. Then, the strike of flint on steel, a sharp, bright spark that lit for a fraction of a second, a miniature, furious star. The spark found the waiting wick, and a new sun was born. The first candle's flame was always a revelation. It did not explode into being but gathered itself, a tentative, teardrop-shaped bloom of pure gold that swayed for a moment, finding its balance in the still air. Then it steadied, growing bolder, its light pushing back the pressing dark not with violence, but with gentle insistence. The darkness retreated to the corners, not banished, but politely asked to wait. The light was a living thing. It was warm, a visual warmth that seemed to radiate tangible comfort. It was gentle, casting a soft, forgiving glow that smoothed the rough edges of the day from faces and softened the hard lines of furniture. This initial flame was a declaration. The night may have the outside, but here, within these walls, there would be light. Then came the second candle, lit from the first. This was a quieter magic, a communion of fire. The wick of the second candle would lean into the parent flame, touch it briefly, and then draw away, now crowned with its own identical, dancing light. The action was one of sharing, of multiplication. One flame became two, and the room's illumination deepened, the pool of golden light expanding, linking the space between the hearth and the table, between the shelf and the chair. Another candle might be lit by the window, its flame a beacon visible from the lane, a silent signal that this home was occupied, awake, and warm. The process repeated in a dozen cottages, 100 times, until the village was no longer a cluster of dark shapes, but a honeycomb of luminous cells. The light had a transformative power. It shone on faces first, revealing them anew in its kinder spectrum. The farmer, washed and in his home clothes, had the sunlines around his eyes softened to mere suggestions. The baker, her hair now loosely tied, had the flour dust ghostly on her skin turned to a gentle highlight. Children, drawn close to the source of the wonder, had their wide eyes turned into pools of reflected gold, their expressions of quiet awe illuminated like small, perfect paintings. The light did not interrogate, it caressed. It turned weary faces into thoughtful ones, and thoughtful faces into peaceful ones. It shone on tables, too. A plain wooden surface, scarred and stained by years of use, became a landscape under the candlelight. The grain of the wood emerged in intricate, swirling patterns, each knot and whorl telling its long history. A simple clay bowl, placed ready for supper, glowed from within, its curve holding a captive shimmer of gold. A loaf of bread, its crust a deep brown, took on a lustrous, almost metallic sheen, the cracks in its top becoming canyons of shadow and highlight. The ordinary was made sacred, the functional made beautiful, by this simple, animate glow. The room, which by day might have been merely a place to pass through, was now a sanctuary, defined and hallowed by the soft, yellow light. The rooms became full of this light. It was not a flat, even brightness, but a dynamic, breathing presence. It gathered in pools around the candles themselves, intense and focused, then faded gracefully into a penumbra of amber, where objects lost their sharpness and became suggestive forms. It lit up the walls, making the whitewash glow and causing the shadows of hanging herbs or copper pots to dance in slow, elongated motions with every subtle draft. It caught the edge of a rocking chair, the curve of a ceramic jug, the spine of a book on a shelf. The air itself seemed thicker, richer, infused with the subtle scent of melting beeswax or the cleaner smell of burning tallow, a perfume of comfort and safety. This was the antithesis of the forge's furious blaze or the oven's dry roar. This was fire domesticated, fire made humble and serviceable. It was a light for seeing by, not for working by. A light for gathering around, not for toiling under. It drew people together, its gentle radius a natural boundary for the family circle. Outside, the wind might pick up, whispering through the thatch, and the vast, star-strewn sky might speak of infinite cold distances. But inside, the candles asserted a different truth. They spoke of the finite, the known, the close at hand. They spoke of a world measured in arm's lengths and soft voices, of stories told in hushed tones, of the simple, profound act of waiting together for the night to pass. The small flames pushed back the dark, not with the ambition of conquering it, but with the quiet confidence of holding a space. They were promises kept, tiny suns sworn to burn until morning, ensuring that within the stone walls and under the thatched roofs, no one would be left in the dark. In one cottage, a mother moved to the window. The small, leaded pane was a square of profound blackness, a lens into the deep night. She held a fresh candle, its wick untrimmed and pale. Leaning close, she touched its tip to the flame of another candle burning steadily on the mantel. A new light was born, a twin to the first. She carried it carefully, the flame bowing and righting itself with her motion, and placed it in a simple iron holder on the broad windowsill. The effect was immediate and profound. The black void of the window transformed. It became a mirror, a shallow pool of darkness that now held a perfect, dancing reflection of the candle's flame. But it also became a beacon. From outside, this single, steady point of gold would be visible to anyone on the path, a silent, welcoming eye in the face of the house. It was a signal, not of alarm, but of presence. It said that within this shell of stone and thatch, life was gathered, warm and watchful. She adjusted the holder slightly, her face momentarily illuminated in the glow, a face composed of soft planes and gentle shadows, etched with the day's cares but now smoothed by the ritual of lighting this watchfire for the night. In another home, a father reached to a high wooden shelf. This shelf held simple treasures, a smooth stone from the river, a carved bird, a small pot that had belonged to his own father. From behind a row of these quiet sentinels, he retrieved a stout beeswax candle, its sides dripped with the history of previous evenings. He lit it from the central candle on the table, its flame joining the chorus. He placed it back on the shelf, pushing it safely away from the wood. The light from this elevated position was different. It fell downward, casting a cone of illumination that picked out the textures of the objects below, the grain of the wood, the curve of the pottery, the feather details on the carving. It lit the wall above, creating a warm, glowing alcove that seemed to sanctify these humble heirlooms. This light was not for practical tasks, it was for memory, for continuity. It silently honored the past, suggesting that the small flames of today were part of a long, unbroken line stretching back through countless nights. He stood for a moment, looking at the arrangement, his own large shadow thrown against the far wall, motionless and content. Children watched, their day's energy finally spent, replaced by a hushed fascination. They sat on stools or on the edge of the hearthrug, their chins in their hands, eyes wide and unblinking. To them, the candlelight was not merely illumination, it was theater. The flames danced, and no two dances were alike. A tiny draft, imperceptible to the adults, would make a flame stretch and lean like a curious flower seeking the sun, then shrink back into a steady teardrop. Another would flicker rapidly, a frantic, golden pulse that sent wild shadows leaping across the ceiling before settling into a gentle sway. The children followed these performances in rapt silence. They saw shapes in the luminous course, tiny castles, sailing ships, faces that formed and melted in the molten heart of the wax. The light was alive, a friendly, captive spirit that painted stories on the walls without a single word. It held their attention completely, weaving a spell of quiet wonder that smoothed the transition from the busy day to the calm night. And on the walls, the shadows moved. They were the candlelight's silent partners, its negative echo. With every flutter of a flame, the shadows responded, elongating, shrinking, merging, and parting. The shadow of a hanging ladle became a giant spoon stirring a pot of night. The shadow of a parent's hand, raised to adjust a shawl, became a great, gentle bird taking flight across the plaster. The children's own shadows, colossal and distorted, mimicked their slightest movements with a slow, dramatic grace. This play of dark and light gave the room depth and mystery. The solid, familiar corners of the cottage became realms of suggestion where the known world blended with the imagined. The shadows did not frighten, they were part of the comfort, a reminder that the light was strong enough to create such dramas and contain them. The room breathed with this slow, silent ballet of illumination and shade, a dynamic equilibrium that felt both exciting and perfectly safe. The house, in its entirety, was now a vessel of safety and brightness. The dark had been partitioned, pushed beyond the doors and windows, allowed to exist only as a backdrop against which this interior world shone all the more brightly. The light pooled on the swept floorboards, gleamed on the polished handle of a cupboard, sparkled in the surface of a water jug. It filled the space not with a harsh, interrogating glare, but with a warm, embracing luminescence that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere at once. The stone walls, which by day were cool and functional, now radiated a stored warmth, their irregularities painted with soft gold. The thatch overhead was lost in a cozy gloom, a ceiling of darkness that the light could not penetrate, making the room feel like a sheltered cave, a nest woven from glow and shadow. Every object, every person, was wrapped in this gentle light, connected by it, made part of a single, tranquil whole. The sense of security was absolute, a physical feeling as tangible as the heat from the hearth. Outside, the night was vast and complete. It pressed against the window panes, a presence of cool, empty stillness. The wind might sigh in the eaves, an owl might call from the woods, the million stars might burn with their cold, distant fires. The night had its own beauty and its own domain, a kingdom of silence and mystery that stretched to the hills and beyond. But inside, there was light. It was a different kingdom, a human-scale realm defined by warmth and sight. The two worlds existed side by side, separated by thin walls and simple glass, each respecting the other. The night was not an enemy to be defeated, but a context that made the candlelight all the more precious. The small, steadfast flames were an answer to the immense dark, not a rebuttal but a quiet affirmation. They affirmed the hearth, the family, the shared breath, the waiting meal. They affirmed that within this small compass of stone and wood and wax, the world was noble, gentle, and bright. The night was outside, profound and star-strewn. But inside, there was light, a humble, glorious, and defiantly human light that held the dark at bay and filled the heart of the home with its golden, breathing peace. The light, having been summoned and set to its gentle work, now presided over the evening's central rite. In the cottages, the families gathered around their tables, drawn into the circles of warmth as naturally as moths, but with a deeper, quieter purpose. The day's separate journeys, the forge, the field, the bakery, the home, converged here, in this shared space defined by wood and cloth and soft, moving light. Chairs scraped softly on the floorboards as they were drawn inward, a sound of settling, of arrival. Bodies, weary in good ways, lowered themselves onto familiar seats with sighs that were not of sorrow, but of release. The table, often bare and functional by day, was now a stage set with simple, well-loved pieces, clay bowls, wooden spoons, a single, shared cup for drinking, a loaf of bread resting on a board like a centerpiece of earth itself. The food was brought forth, not with ceremony, but with a steady, habitual grace. From the hearth, where a pot had been simmering for hours, a mother lifted the lid. A cloud of fragrant steam billowed up, catching the candlelight and turning into a glowing, ephemeral ghost before dissolving into the room. The smell was rich and immediate, a deep, savory aroma of onions softened to sweetness, of herbs from the garden, of barley and the tender pieces of mutton that had cooked to falling apart softness. She ladled the thick soup into the waiting bowls, the sound a soft, liquid plash that was profoundly comforting. In another home, it might be a stew of roots and beans, or a simple broth with dumplings, but the essence was the same, warmth offered freely. The bread, often still faintly warm from the baker's final batch, was passed from hand to hand. A father would take the loaf, his work-roughened fingers gentle as they broke it apart. The crust made a soft, tearing sound, a crisp whisper that gave way to the pale, soft interior steaming faintly in the cool air. He would place a piece in each bowl, around the edge, where it could soak up the broth and become its own kind of sustenance. The breaking and sharing was the first silent communication of the meal, an act of provision that needed no words. The bread was the bridge between the labor of the field and the comfort of the hearth, the gift of the baker and the gift of the earth, now completing its purpose in their hands. They began to eat. The first spoonfuls lifted slowly, steam curling around the spoons before vanishing. The food was warm, a warmth that traveled from the bowl through the hands and into the body, a direct infusion of comfort that seemed to melt the last residual chill of the evening air from their bones. The flavors were simple, honest, and deeply satisfying. There was a quiet concentration on those first few bites, a pure, physical appreciation for the transformation of raw ingredients into this cohesive, nourishing whole. The candlelight shone on the surfaces of the broth, making each bowl a miniature, golden pond, and gleamed on the curves of the spoons as they rose and fell. Then, the talk began. It did not break the silence so much as weave itself into it, using the same quiet tones. Their voices were low and calm, murmurs that blended with the soft crackle of the hearth and the occasional scrape of a bowl. They talked about the day, but not in grand narratives. A child mentioned the frog he had seen by the stream. The blacksmith, Elias, now washed and in a clean shirt, gave a slow nod when his wife asked if the hinge for the miller's gate was finished. A farmer, his hands wrapped around his bowl for its heat, remarked that the south field was finally clear and that the stooks stood well. The words were not exciting, but they were important. They were the small, vital stitches that sewed the individual day's experiences back into the fabric of the shared life. They were acknowledgments, reassurances, tiny reports from the frontiers of their separate hours. The candlelight was a participant in this communion. It shone on their faces as they spoke, highlighting an expression here, softening a line there. It caught the earnest look in a child's eye as he recounted his adventure, illuminated the patient smile of a parent listening, glinted in the beard of the farmer as he chewed thoughtfully. It danced in the depths of their cider cups and made the humble soup bowls seem like vessels of liquid gold. The light unified them, painting them all with the same warm, gentle palette, erasing the differences that the sun might have emphasized, the soot on the smith, the flour on the baker, the soil on the farmer. Here, in this glow, they were simply a family, their faces turned toward one another, connected by the shared circle of illumination and the shared act of breaking bread. The room itself seemed to lean in, a silent witness full of quiet happiness. The shadows, which had danced so wildly for the children earlier, now rested peacefully in the corners, still and deep. The fire in the hearth settled to a steady, pulsing glow, its heat a constant, reassuring presence at their backs. The smells of the food mingled with the beeswax scent of the candles and the clean, woody smell of the burning logs, creating a unique perfume that was the very signature of evening in that home. There was no hurry. Spoons moved slowly. Conversations drifted and paused, comfortable in their silences. A second helping might be offered and accepted with a nod. The bread was broken again, smaller now, to wipe the last of the soup from the bowls. This was more than sustenance, it was an anchor. The day, with all its outward effort and scattered focus, was being gathered in, digested not just in the body but in the spirit. The stories told, however minor, placed the day's events into a shared history. The simple, good food restored the body and affirmed the providence of their world. The warm, steady light held the encroaching night at a respectful distance, creating a pocket of timeless peace. In this interval, the worries of tomorrow had no purchase. The fatigue of today was being transformed into a pleasant, heavy contentment. As the meal drew to a close, the bowls emptied, the last crumbs of bread gathered from the board, a profound sense of completeness settled over the table. The talk dwindled to a few last, soft remarks. A hand might reach out to briefly cover another on the table, a wordless gesture of solidarity and affection. The children, their bellies full and their minds soothed by the rhythm of the adult voices, began to lean against their parents, eyelids growing heavy. The candles, shorter now, burned with a steady, unwavering flame, their light perhaps even more precious as the night deepened outside. The room was full, not with noise or activity, but with a palpable, quiet happiness. It was the happiness of needs met, of company shared, of a safe harbor reached at the end of the day's voyage. The evening meal was the quiet, beating heart of the home, a daily sacrament of soup and bread and soft light, where the village, fractured by day into its separate trades and tasks, became whole again, one family, one table, one circle of golden light at a time. The last echo of human activity, the soft closing of a cottage door, faded into the night. The village now belonged to a different kind of quiet, a deeper, more ancient rhythm. In the barns and coops and stables, the animals, who had sensed the sunset long before the first candle was lit, completed their own rituals of rest. Their world was one of instinct and gentle routine, a parallel existence of warmth and breath and straw, unfolding in the fragrant dark. The gray barn stood as a cathedral of shadow, its high roof lost in a gloom that the moonlight, filtering through cracks in the siding, could not penetrate. Inside, the air was thick and still, laden with the sweet, dusty perfume of dry hay, the earthy musk of hide, and the clean, pungent scent of manure, a honest, wholesome smell of life sustained. The cows were the first to settle, their great, slow-moving forms dark islands in the bedding. One by one, they had folded their legs beneath them, a process of careful, deliberate collapse that shook the floorboards and sent up small clouds of chaff. Now they lay in a row along the stone feed trough, their sides rising and falling with a slow, tidal rhythm of cut chewing. Their jaws moved in a steady, side-to-side sway, a peaceful, grinding sound that was the bass line of the barn's nighttime symphony. Their large, liquid eyes were half closed, reflecting slivers of distant starlight from the ventilation slats, seeing nothing but the comfort of the dark. Warmth radiated from their bodies, creating a collective, living heat that made the barn's interior noticeably warmer than the frost-touched night outside. In the adjoining stalls, the horses were quiet. Their day of pulling carts or standing patiently while being shod was over. They stood hip-shod in the deep straw, heads lowered, nostrils occasionally flaring as they sampled the familiar, safe scents of the night. One, old dray horse with a white blaze, let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound of profound release that stirred the mane of his neighbor. They did not lie down like the cows. Their vigilance was a different kind, a lighter sleep with ears that twitched at every unknown sound, the scuttle of a mouse in the loft, the call of a distant fox. But here, within the solid walls, they were at ease. Their tails swished lazily at imaginary flies, and the soft chink of a hoof against a stone was a rare, solitary note in the stillness. Above, in the rafters, the chickens were already asleep. Perched in a row on the thick wooden pole, they were rounded, feathery bundles, each head tucked neatly under a wing. They were utterly still, transformed from the bustling, scratching, clucking creatures of daylight into perfect, compact sculptures of repose. Occasionally, one would utter a faint, drowsy croon, a dream whisper of contentment. The air in the coop corner was drier, carrying the faint, chalky smell of feathers and dust. They were vulnerable in their sleep, yet perfectly secure, protected by the barn's stout walls and the familiar sounds of the larger animals below. The farmer, having eaten his own evening meal, made his final round. He entered not with a lamp, for his eyes were adjusted and the animals knew his shape and scent, but with a bucket that sloshed with fresh, cool water from the well. His boots made soft, sucking sounds in the damp straw at the entrance. The cows turned their heads slightly at his approach, their chewing pausing for a beat before resuming. He moved down the line, tipping the bucket to refill the long, trough-like waterer. The water poured with a clear, splashing sound that seemed incredibly loud in the hush, a brief interruption of the soft grinding and breathing. The horses lifted their heads, ears pricking forward, and took a few steps to dip their muzzles into the fresh drink, sucking noisily before returning to their restful stance. His work was simple, almost meditative. He checked a latch on a stall door, his hands knowing the smooth, warm wood without looking. He pushed a stray forkful of hay closer to a resting cow. He stood for a long moment, a silhouette against the slightly lighter rectangle of the open doorway, simply listening and feeling the peace of the place. This was the culmination of his care, the visible proof of his stewardship. The animals were safe, fed, watered, and content. Their well-being was his quiet pride, a responsibility as natural as breathing. He did not speak aloud, for words were a human invention and held little meaning here. But as he turned to leave, he let his hand rest for a moment on the broad, warm forehead of the old dray horse. The gesture was his good night. It was a transfer of gratitude, an unspoken acknowledgement of their shared existence, of the mutual dependency that bound his world to theirs. The horse blew softly through its nostrils, a warm puff of air against his palm, and lowered its head again. Then he was gone, pulling the heavy barn door closed behind him. The iron latch fell with a soft, definitive thud. The last sliver of moonlight from outside was extinguished, leaving the barn in a darkness that was total but not oppressive. It was a velvety, complete dark, rich with the sounds and smells of sleeping life. The cows chewed. A horse stamped once. The straw rustled as a creature settled more deeply. The warmth from the animals rose, meeting the cool air from the roof in a gentle, constant convection. The barn was dark and peaceful. It was a world apart, a capsule of slow breath and steady heartbeats. Outside, the stars wheeled and the moon traced its arc inside. Time moved at the pace of digestion and dreamless sleep. The animals, cared for and secure, surrendered completely to the night. Their rest was the village's other heartbeat, a slower, deeper pulse that thrummed alongside the human silence in the cottages. In their quiet barn, they dreamed whatever dreams animals do, of sun warm pastures and sweet grass, their simple, vital presence a foundational pillar of the sleeping village's peace. The farmer walked back to his own lit window, knowing all was well. The night watch was shared, and in the fragrant dark of the stable, it was kept with a perfect, untroubled grace. The well stood in the center of the square, a circle of ancient, moss-dappled stone that was the village's quiet heart. All day it had served, its bucket rising and falling, its rope groaning softly against the wooden windlass, its clear, cold water drawn up into the light. Now, as dusk settled into the deep blue of early night, it awaited its final visitor. The square around it was empty, swept clean of the day's comings and goings. The last of the twilight clung only to the highest points, the weather vane on the wellhouse roof, the tip of the old yew tree that shaded the eastern side. The ground was already in shadow, the cobbles dark and damp with evening dew. The well, in this transitional hour, seemed less a tool and more a monument, a stoic presence holding the memory of every thirst it had ever quenched. She came from the lane that led to the last cottage on the western edge, a clay pitcher balanced on her hip. Ilara was her name, though in this moment she was simply the last one, the final link in the day's chain of necessity. Her steps were unhurried, her figure a slender silhouette against the fading glow in the west. The silence of the square was so complete that the soft scuff of her leather shoes on the cobbles seemed to echo. She approached the well with a practiced familiarity, her free hand reaching out to touch the cool, rough stone of its rim as if greeting an old friend. The bucket waited, a dark wooden shape suspended over the black circle of the well mouth. She took the crank handle in both hands. The mechanism gave a soft, protesting creak, a sound that seemed enormously loud in the stillness, a lone voice speaking into the gathering night. Then the rope began to unwind, its fibers whispering against the wooden axle as the bucket descended into the darkness. She leaned slightly, listening. There was no visual marker, only the diminishing sound of the rope and the faint, hollow echo from below. Then, a distant, soft plunk, a sound so muted it was felt as much as heard. The bucket had met the water. She waited a beat, allowing it to fill, then began to turn the crank the other way. This was the heavier work. The rope tightened, the wood groaned with a deeper tone, and the bucket began its ascent, dripping as it rose. She turned steadily, her arms working with a smooth, efficient rhythm born of 1,000 repetitions. The sound of the crank was a steady, rhythmic click-creak, a mechanical heartbeat in the silent square. Up came the bucket, breaking the surface of the water far below, then climbing through the cool, damp air of the stone shaft, until finally its dark, dripping form emerged into the twilight at the well's mouth. She swung it inward, the water within sloshing with a cool, clear sound. The bucket came to rest on the stone ledge. In the dim light, the water was a surface of perfect, dark liquid, but as she dipped her pitcher into it, the disturbance caught the last bit of sky glow, breaking it into 100 shifting shards of silver and deep blue. The water was profoundly cool, a cold that emanated from the deep earth itself. She filled her pitcher to the brim, the water pouring with a soft, musical gurgle. A few drops splashed onto the well's rim, darkening the gray stone instantly. She lifted the heavy pitcher, settling it again on her hip, the coolness of the clay seeping through her skirt. Her task was complete. She gave the bucket a slight push, sending it back to hang over the void. It swayed gently for a moment, the last drops from its bottom falling with tiny, ringing plinks into the darkness far below. Then it was still. She stood for a moment, looking down into the well. From its depths rose a cool, damp breath, smelling of wet stone and ancient, clean earth. It was the smell of depth, of patience, of a secret kept by the ground. The circle of darkness below was absolute, a pupil in the eye of the village, seeing nothing but its own hidden water and the single, fading coin of sky above. Then she turned and walked away, her footsteps once again the only sound. She did not look back. The water in her pitcher was a way of certainty, the final ingredient for the night, for a last cup of tea, for washing a child's face, for topping up the kettle for the morning. She carried the essence of the well home with her, a moving vessel of its cool, clear gift. Her figure receded down the lane, was softened by the gloom, and then was gone, absorbed into the deeper darkness between the cottages. The well was left alone. The square around it was empty and quiet. The silence that returned was different now. It was a finished silence. The day's cycle of drawing and carrying was over. The stone rim was cool under the touch of the night air. The wooden bucket hung motionless, a still pendulum waiting for dawn's first hand. The water far below settled, its surface becoming a perfect, undisturbed mirror once more, reflecting nothing but the distant, pinprick glimpse of the first star directly overhead. The night was here. It poured into the square, filling it like a slow, rising tide. It pooled in the corners of the well house, gathered under the bench where people sat to talk at midday, and smoothed the edges of every cobblestone. The blue in the sky deepened to indigo, then to a blackness that was softened by the emergence of more stars. The well became a part of the nightscape, a darker circle within the dark square. It was no longer a place of activity, but a place of potential. It held its water in trust, a buried treasure that would be there, unchanged and reliable, when the sun returned and the first thirsty person came with their bucket. All around, the village continued its surrender to the evening. From a nearby cottage, the faint, golden rectangle of a window shone, but it was a private light, turned inward. No one looked out onto the square. The well required no watching. It was a covenant between the village and the earth, and the covenant was being honored by this respectful silence. The night air grew cooler, carrying now the distinct, sweet scent of wood smoke from 100 bank fires. A lone bat flickered overhead, a silent, jagged stitch across the starfield, but it did not dip toward the well. Even the creatures of the dusk understood its diurnal rhythm. The well was still. It was a center of stillness within the sleeping village. Its quiet was not empty, but profound, the quiet of a source at rest, of a function fulfilled. The square, framed by the dark shapes of thatched roofs and garden walls, was a stage after the actors had departed. The only movement was the imperceptible creep of starlight across the stones, and the only sound was the whisper of a night breeze that occasionally found its way into the square, stirring the dust by the well's base before moving on. The well endured the night as it had endured 1,000 others, a patient, stone-lipped guardian of the deep, cold water, waiting in perfect, silent readiness for the turn of the world and the return of the light. From the path that skirted the village, where the last farmer's footfall had faded into the soft earth, the night presented a singular, captivating vision. The village was no longer a collection of structures, but a cluster of quiet light. Against the immense, velvety blackness of the sky and the deeper shadows of the surrounding hills, the cottage windows glowed. They were perfect golden squares and rectangles, some large and steady, others small and flickering, scattered among the dark, hunched forms of the thatched roofs like a handful of luminous gems carelessly dropped and caught in the hollow of the land. This was the village's true face in the deep evening, not its busy, sunlit self, but its introspective, radiant heart revealed. Each window was a world entire, a frame around a private universe. They were not mere holes in the darkness, but deliberate apertures of warmth, each one a story whispered in light. From this respectful distance, the observer could not see the details, the faces, the furniture, the specific movements, but the light itself was narrative enough. A larger, steadier glow from a ground floor window suggested a main room, a hearth, a family gathered. A smaller, softer square higher up, under the eaves, spoke of a bedroom, a child being settled, a solitary moment of reflection before sleep. The light was a language, and its grammar was one of invitation and promise. It promised a chair by the fire after the chill of the evening air. It promised the weight of a blanket and the sound of familiar voices, low and calm. It promised the end of journeying, the cessation of labor, the simple, profound act of being inside, enclosed and safe. Behind those panes of glass or oiled parchment, life moved in gentle pantomime. Shadows passed across the light, elongated and softened by the diffuse glow. A figure would approach the window, becoming a dark silhouette that momentarily blotted out the gold, perhaps to draw a curtain or simply to gaze out at the very night that now gazed in. Then it would recede, absorbed back into the room's bright interior. In another window, a smaller, quicker shadow darted, a child, perhaps, released from the table and moving with the boundless, erratic energy that precedes the final surrender to bed. The movements were slow, purposeful, unhurried. They were the movements of routine, of rituals performed 1,000 times, a bowl being cleared, a hand smoothing a tablecloth, a head bending over a mending basket. Each silent motion, seen from the outside, was a stitch in the fabric of the evening, a part of the quiet industry that turned a house into a home. The light itself had a tangible quality, as if the warmth it signified had leaked out into the cool night air. It was a honeyed, buttery gold, the color of beeswax candles and well-seasoned hearthstones. It did not pierce the darkness so much as push against it, holding it at a gentle bay. Where the light from a window spilled out onto the ground immediately before a cottage, it painted the dirt path or the patch of herbs with a soft, ethereal wash, making the world immediately around the house seem enchanted, separate from the deep shadows just a few feet away. The illumination was kind. It smoothed the rough-hewn edges of timber frames, turned simple leaded panes into grids of molten gold, and made the very smoke that curled from the chimney above each window seem like a plume of darkened silk rising into the starfield. Above this earthly constellation, the dark sky presided, an infinite dome of profound and silent majesty. The stars were sharper here, away from the direct glow, their cold, diamond points a stark contrast to the warm, living light of the windows. They served as a reminder of the scale of the night, of the cosmic chill that lay beyond the village's fragile bubble of warmth. The moon, if it was risen, would cast its own colder silver, bleaching the thatch and etching the lanes in monochrome, but it could not compete with the emotional pull of the window light. The sky was awe-inspiring, but the windows were beckoning. One spoke of eternity and mystery, the other spoke of supper and a bed and a known hand to hold. And so the village existed in this perfect equilibrium, a cluster of quiet light and a vast field of dark. It was not a fortress against the night, but a companion to it. The darkness was not an enemy, but a respectful audience, making the light seem all the more precious, all the more deliberate. From the path, the sight stirred a deep, wordless feeling. It was the feeling of seeing a lantern in a distant window when one is still out in the cold. It was the feeling of community made visible, not as a crowd or a noise, but as a collective, silent exhalation of comfort and rest. Each golden square was a vote for warmth, a declaration that here, in this specific spot, people had chosen to create light, to gather, to cease from the day's labors and simply be together. The village, in this moment, was not its buildings or its roads, but this gentle, glowing consensus against the dark, a testament to the human need for a hearth, and the profound beauty of that need when seen from the outside, in the deepening quiet of the night. The constellation of golden squares began its slow, graceful dissolution. It did not happen all at once, for the village did not sleep as a single entity, but as a collection of individual hearts and habits winding down at their own gentle pace. The extinguishing of the lights was the final, silent act of the day, a visual lullaby played out against the black velvet of the night. First, one window became dark. It was a small, high window under the eaves of the cottage nearest the old oak. The light there had been soft and faint, perhaps a single candle by a bedside. It did not snap out of existence, but seemed to soften, to shrink into itself, and then was gone. The square of gold simply ceased, replaced by the same deep, uniform black as the wall around it and the sky above. The effect was subtle, like a single star winking out in a crowded sky. Yet its absence was felt. That particular promise of warmth was withdrawn, folded inward as the person behind the pane surrendered to sleep. The darkness that filled the space felt heavier, more complete, as if the night had taken a small, soft breath and held it. Then another window followed, and another. A ground floor window at the end of the lane, which had shown the steady, robust glow of a hearth fire, dimmed to a deep orange ember glow, then vanished behind the sudden, solid shape of a closed shutter. The click of its latch was a tiny, definitive sound in the stillness. Across the square, two windows in the miller's house went dark in quick succession, first the kitchen, then the parlor. Each disappearance was a quiet subtraction, a reduction of the village's visible warmth. The process was not mournful, but natural and inevitable, like petals closing at dusk. People were going to sleep. Bodies, tired from the honest labors of the forge, the field, the bakery, and the home, were seeking the deeper restoration of dreams. Minds were letting go of the day's minor worries and joys, releasing them into the safekeeping of the night. With each light that vanished, the village became quieter. Not that there had been noise before, but the quality of the silence deepened, thickened. The human world was receding. The faint, domestic sounds that had seeped through walls, The murmur of a last conversation, the clink of a cup being set down, the creak of a floorboard under a final, weary step, all faded away. What remained were the sounds that belonged to the night itself, the sigh of the wind in the thatch, the distant gurgle of the stream, the call of an owl from the wood. These sounds, no longer competing with human activity, seemed to grow clearer, to fill the auditory space left behind. The village was handing the night back to its original inhabitants, the earth and the air and the creatures that moved through them. The remaining windows shone all the more brightly for their diminishing numbers. They became brave, solitary beacons. A single, steadfast light in the weaver's cottage burned on, perhaps where an old woman sat finishing a few last rows by the fire, her hands moving with automatic skill in the pool of light. Another, in the constable's house, remained illuminated, a sign of his watchful, though peaceful, duty. These persistent lights seemed to gather significance, their glow more focused, more poignant. They were the final sentinels of consciousness, holding out against the tide of sleep a little longer. Their light spilled out onto the dewy grass with a lonely beauty, painting long, trembling rectangles of gold on the dark ground. But one by one, they too began to yield. The weaver's light trembled once, as if a hand had passed before it, and then was gone. The constable's window dimmed, not to blackness, but to the faint, red glow of a bank fire seen through a slightly opened damper. The children had long since been carried to bed, now the adults followed. The last activities of the evening, the banking of the hearth, the checking of the door latch, the final glance out at the quiet lane, were completed. Then, the last candle was blown out, while the last lamp was turned down. The light would vanish, often from the center outward, the golden square shrinking to a yellow point and then to nothing. Finally, only a handful of windows remained. They glowed like the last coals of a great, scattered fire. One, high in the gable of the largest farmhouse, burned with a clear, steady flame. Perhaps someone lay awake, listening to the night, or perhaps it was left burning for a traveler not yet home. For a long time, it seemed it would burn forever, a permanent jewel in the village's night crown. But then, it too began to fade. The light softened, grew diffuse, and finally succumbed, not with a sudden snap, but with a gentle, sighing disappearance, as if the flame had simply decided its work was done. The square of window was instantly absorbed into the general gloom, indistinguishable from the wall around it. The last window of all was in the smallest cottage, nestled between the bakery and the blacksmith's. It had burned with a soft, unwavering light for nearly an hour after the others had gone dark. Then, it too began to dim. The golden light turned a deep amber, then a faint orange, as if the candle were drowning in its own wax. The glow shrank to a mere pinprick, a single, persistent eye of light winking from the deep socket of the window. It held on for a long, breathless moment, the final point of human wakefulness in this sleeping valley. And then, with a tenderness that was almost palpable, it went out. The village was dark. The transformation was complete. The cluster of quiet light had dissolved back into the landscape from which it had seemed to detach itself at dusk. The cottages were now mere humps of deeper shadow against the slightly lighter sky, their shapes blending with the hills. The windows were blank, secretive. No life was visible, no movement hinted from within. The village had turned entirely inward, its consciousness folded away into dreams, its warmth held close under blankets and behind stone walls. The sky, free from the competition of earthly light, reasserted its grandeur. The stars blazed with a cold, fierce clarity, and the Milky Way spilled its ghostly river across the zenith. The moon, if it was aloft, cast its sterile, beautiful silver over the thatched roofs and empty lanes. But the human light, the warm, golden light of hearth and candle, was gone. It had served its purpose. It had guided the people home, gathered them, comforted them, and watched over their final waking moments. Now it was retired, its duty faithfully discharged. The windows were dark, the villagers asleep, and the night, in its vast and starry silence, settled over the village like a soft, heavy blanket, cradling it until the first hint of dawn would stir the eastern hills and begin the slow, reverse miracle of light all over again. The village slept. It was a sleep so deep and so complete it seemed less a state of being than a substance, a soft, dark wool that had been drawn over the houses, the lanes, the fields, and the minds within them. The last window was dark, the last latch clicked shut, the last conscious thought had dissolved into the formless realm of dreams. What remained was an architecture of silence, a landscape surrendered utterly to the moon and the stars. The moon, having climbed to its zenith, now reigned with a serene, silver authority. It was not the full, bold hunter's moon of story, but a waxing crescent, a delicate, polished sliver hanging in the profound blackness. Its light was cool and precise, a luminous ink that spilled over the world, picking out edges with meticulous care. It traced the sharp, clean line of each rooftop's ridge, silvered the thatch until it looked like frozen starlight, and painted the cobbles of the square with a faint, metallic sheen. Where the shadows fell, they were not mere absences of light, but pools of solid, velvet black, so deep they seemed to have their own texture. The moonlight did not seek to conquer this dark, but to collaborate with it, creating a world of stark, beautiful contrasts, a monochrome masterpiece of silver and ink. This light flowed like a silent river through the streets. It ran in a thin, bright stream down the center of the main lane, finding every tiny pebble and groove. It filtered through the bare branches of the orchard trees, casting a lacework of shadows that trembled almost imperceptibly on the ground below. It gleamed on the still surface of the horse trough, turning it into a plate of polished pewter. At the well, it caught the curve of the stone rim and the dark, waiting mouth, making the ancient structure look like a temple to some quiet, nocturnal god. The village, so familiar and humble by day, was transfigured. Under this celestial gaze, it became a place of mystery and gentle grandeur, its simplicity rendered profound. All was calm. The wind that had whispered through the afternoon had died to nothing more than an occasional, sleeping breath. It would stir, lifting a single dry leaf from the inn's doorstep and carrying it a few feet with a soft, scraping sigh before letting it fall again into stillness. The weather vane on the wellhouse roof was frozen, pointing a silent, iron finger toward the hills. Not a shutter tapped, not a sign creaked. The air itself felt settled, a crystal-clear medium through which the moonlight moved unimpeded. It was cool, carrying the clean, mineral scent of dew forming on grass and the distant, cool perfume of the pine woods on the higher slopes. The warmth of the day, the heat of forges and ovens and crowded rooms had all been absorbed, leaving a perfect, neutral coolness that was neither harsh nor gentle, but simply true. All was still. In the barns, the animals were motionless in their rest. The cows lay like great, breathing hills in the straw, their chewing ceased at last. The horses stood in a statuesque doze, their tails still. Even the mice in the thatch, the owls in the woods, seemed to be holding a collective pause in this deepest hour. The stream's murmur was the only constant sound, a low, liquid whisper that did not break the stillness but somehow deepened it, a sonic representation of time's endless, patient flow. If one stood in the center of the square and listened with every fiber, one might hear the faint, almost imaginary sigh of the earth itself, cooling and contracting under the stars. The stillness was not emptiness, it was a fullness of rest, a positive achievement of peace. The last light was the moon and the stars. They were the sole custodians of the visible world. The stars, undimmed by any rival glow, blazed with an icy, multitudinous fervor. They were not just points, but colors, diamond white, cool blue, a hint of rusty gold. The Milky Way arched overhead, a vast, ghostly bridge of powdered light, so palpable it seemed one might feel its dust on an upraised hand. This celestial light was ancient and indifferent, shining as it had for millennia. Yet, on this night, over this sleeping village, it felt strangely tender. It was a watchful light, a blanket of distant fires kept burning for no one and for everyone. It asked for nothing, promised nothing, yet its constant presence was a kind of silent companionship for the dark, human world below. The villagers rested. Behind each dark window, in the soft gloom of their chambers, they were adrift in the private seas of sleep. The farmer's hands, calloused and strong, lay open and relaxed on the woolen blanket. The baker's face, usually dusted with flour, was smooth and untroubled. The blacksmith's mighty shoulders had finally released their perpetual readiness. Children curled into small, warm knots, their breath coming in soft, even puffs. Dreams moved among them, simple, fleeting things, memories of sun on fields, the smell of bread, the sound of a familiar laugh. There were no nightmares here, not in this quiet. The sleep was a healing immersion, a drawing back from the world to repair the tiny wearinesses of the day, to store strength for the dawn. Their collective rest was the village's true heartbeat now, a slow, rhythmic pulse of unconscious life. They were home. This was the final, foundational truth of the night. However far they had roamed during the day, to the farthest field, to the neighboring market town, they had all been drawn back to this specific cluster of stones and thatch. Their bodies occupied familiar beds in familiar rooms under familiar roofs. The walls around them held the accumulated warmth of shared lives, the echoes of generations. The doors were locked, not against danger, but as a ritual of completion, a symbolic turning inward. Home was not just a location, it was a condition of the soul achieved at day's end, a return to the source of one's own story. In the dark, each sleeper knew, without knowing, the exact sound of the floorboard that would creak by the door, the feel of the quilt's pattern under their fingertips, the way the morning light would fall across the floor. They were anchored, safe in the deepest sense. They were safe. The night held no terrors for them. The peace of the village was not a fragile thing, but a stout, woven fabric of trust and routine. The doors needed no bars, the windows needed no shutters fastened against malice. The safety was in the community itself, in the knowledge that everyone, like everyone else, was asleep and that the world was ordered and kind. It was the safety of the watched-over child, but earned by the labor of adulthood. The quiet night was their guardian. Its stillness was a moat, its starry sky a protective dome. Wolves did not come here. Strangers did not wander in the dark. The only footsteps were those of the gentle, retreating fox, and the only eyes that watched were the wide, indifferent eyes of the owls. The villagers slept the safe, deep sleep of those who have done their work well and whose world is, for these hours, perfectly at peace. The night was gentle and deep. It cradled the village in a vast, soft hand. The cool air was a balm. The silence was a lullaby. The moonlight was a cool kiss on the brow of every roof. This was not the threatening dark of wilderness or the lonely dark of the traveler, but a domestic dark, a friendly and familiar element. It was deep, yes, bottomless in its star-filled expanse above, profound in the solid, trusting sleep of the people below. But its depth was comforting, an embrace from which they would emerge refreshed. The gentle night held them all, the just and the simple, the old and the young, in a single, unified slumber. It asked for nothing but their rest, and in return, it gifted them with this perfect, silent interval of repair, this dark and tender pause between the setting and the rising of the sun. The village dreamed on, a single, breathing entity under the moon, utterly at peace in the gentle, deep heart of the night.